I want to turn to Acts chapter 1, please. Acts chapter 1. The Apostle Luke wrote the book of Acts to Theophilus as a second volume of his account about Jesus and the early church. He says that right there in the first sentence. If we could turn to Acts chapter 1, verse 1, please, and follow the text. I want to follow the text here about Pentecost, and where it indicates how many people were involved in the various exact events that occurred here in the text, in Luke's account, and how that number grew over time, because that gives us an important hint. In verse 2 of Acts chapter 1, Luke speaks of Jesus giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles. But that would be the surviving 11, because Judas is now excluded because he committed suicide. In verse 4, Luke records that Jesus told them to stay at Jerusalem and wait for the gift that he had previously spoken about. The time and place was so obvious to everyone that Jesus did not need to inspire Luke to make note of it. Now, this omission then becomes a critical factor later on for my closing point. If the early church was anything like today's church, it would not be long before the news of the events that were said in private by Jesus and to his apostles was spread to all the people who were concerned about Jesus. Jesus gave convincing proofs, and there were a lot of people who were interested in what Jesus had to say. And this was especially true since Jesus promised a blessing for attending. Attending what? In verse 12, the apostles returned to the upstairs room that they were using for lodging, and the 11 were listed by name, along with several others, including Mary, the mother of Jesus. Some days later, unspecified, starting in verse 15, Peter addresses a group of about 120 followers, whom he calls brothers. So let me ask the first odd question. How many people were in the group of 120? I am not trying to contradict Luke, but trying to propose that there were more than 120 people there, because surely there were children, possibly children and spouses, and there were more than 120, and some of whom didn't count in Luke's total. And let me ask a second question. Assume only 120 were present. How much space would you need for 120 adults? We all have been in organized groups. I guess you could say this was an organized group. We've been in spontaneous crowds. There are websites on the internet for everything. There's websites for space planning of organized meetings. One such site even has a large selection of meeting room layouts to choose from, different layouts of banquets and classrooms and so on. Using that meeting planner, if we were to propose a classroom setting, a traditional modern-day classroom for 120 people, they estimate that it requires almost 2,900 square feet. If you had a theater arrangement, it would need only 1,081 square feet, and a reception, which is standing, might have some tables around the periphery, is 1,136 square feet. By comparison, the first house that my wife and I bought, 3-bedroom, 1-bath, kitchen, dining area, was 24 by 48 feet. It was 1,152 square feet. So a reception-style meeting for 120 people would need a room about the size of my house. A crowd of 120, a crowd tends to be a lot more compact, would be smaller. If you had been in Israel and seen as a tourist, they have areas like my wife and I went to Capernaum and saw what they claimed was Peter's house. Well, there are Winnebagos going by on the interstate right now that are bigger than Peter's house. Our house that we had, the modest house that we had at the time, is probably 2 or 3 times the size of this house they claim was Peter's house. Chapter 2, so the point here being that a typical house of that era could not hold anywhere near 120 people. Now, chapter 2 of Acts takes place on the day of Pentecost, and that there would have been a number of days since the gathering when Matthias was chosen by the apostles to replace Judas. The number of believers certainly would have grown by word of mouth to more than 120. And there would have been an enormous number of people at the temple, up on the Temple Mount, the Herod's temple, possibly hundreds of thousands of people. And the temple itself area occupies 36 acres. So if we could look at Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Acts 2, verse 1. And when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in the same place. And suddenly a sound like a violent rushing wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. And divided tongues of fire appeared on them and rested on each of them. And in verse 4, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them the ability to speak out. Now my question is, where did this occur? If you go to BibleHub.com and look up Acts 2:2, they have a number of translations. I didn't count them, maybe 20 or 25 translations. And they all, almost without exception, refer to a house. That's where it took place. Beyond that, I looked in several commentaries where they mention what was filled. If they mention it at all, it was a house. Some state it was the upper room. Surely the number attending would have grown to at least somewhat more from the day that Peter addressed 120 people, that he called brothers, especially given that Jesus himself had promised a blessing for attending this future event. So there would have been more than 120 people who came together at the same place. And this presents a problem. I hope that you see the problem now. No normal house, no upper room of that era would have been big enough. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:6 says that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at a time, at once. Whether some of the 500 were in the group of 120 is unknown. But it's safe to assume that most of the 500 would have been in Jerusalem at the temple for Pentecost. The Greek word translated house in verse 2 is oikon. That's Strong's number 3620. Strong's tells us this word is translated house or home. But later on, at the end of the definition, it says, it ends with, or even the house of God. Kind of as an afterthought, I would say. When I looked up this word on the website of the New Testament Greek authority, Dr. Bill Mounts, who also was one of the translators of the NIV, he had the following meanings for that word, oikon, as house or home, a physical edifice, of royalty, a palace, of deity, a temple, by extension, family and lineage, people who lived in or originated in a particular house. So we have the house of David, and so on. Dr. Mounts lists some usages with citations. Two of these are of interest. So the one of them is in 1 Timothy 3:15, which I'll read. 1 Timothy 3:15 says, "But if I am delayed, I am writing in order that you may know how one must conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and mainstay of the truth." And the other one is in 1 Peter 2:5, by which he means a spiritual house or structure. And 1 Peter 2:5 says, "And you yourselves are living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." So we have two passages here that help us to see that the word oikon in Acts 2:2 is, I would say, poorly translated. God's spiritual house on earth was the physical temple in Jerusalem. That's very plain because, when Solomon dedicated the temple, God sent down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice. That was in 2 Chronicles 7:1. The temple was where the apostles and their followers met for Pentecost. So now go back to verse 5 of Acts chapter 2, where other people now join the original group. We go from a group size of well over 120 to several thousand, yet again bigger than anyone's house could hold, let alone an upper room. And there is only one place in Jerusalem where such a crowd could assemble, and that is the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount Plaza measures 36 acres, which is about 1.5 million square feet. On a side, 1.5 million square feet is 1,250 feet. That's a quarter of a mile. Can you imagine? Well, of course, some of you have been in a field. Some of you actually may own a field that's 40 acres. You go down here 40 acres, and how far down the fence line do you go? The perimeter of the plaza was marked by a portico supported by stone columns spaced about 18 feet apart. Imagine the plaza a quarter of a mile on a side, and you are walking down the side to find a rabbi who was known to be teaching the truth, the gospel, every day. You would expect those waiting for the rabbi to start his lesson would tend to gravitate around the same place every day, roughly at the same column along the same side of the fence, It's kind of like how people choose to seat themselves at church. You tend to get habituated to one place. In Jewish culture, where the rabbi held classes, it became known as the Bet Midrash, the house of teaching. That was his house of teaching. And was a certain column down the side of the temple portico, did that become known as the Bet Midrash for the disciples of Yeshua? Was this then his house, itself a location in a bigger house, the temple of God? To what extent was this backstory woven into Luke's choice of use of the word oikon? Now, of course, that's unknowable in this age. The temple was the house of God, and there Jesus was holding a house of teaching every day. And if you could look down then to verse 5, he says, "Now there were Jews residing in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven." So now we make a little bit more progression, but don't forget that the sacrifice begins at 9 a.m. So the order of service for the high day is sacrifice at 9 and at 3. And so there was a predictable cadence, so to speak, of the events that were going to occur. And almost certainly these events for the giving of the Holy Spirit occurred at 9 a.m. And then this sound occurred, and the crowd gathered and was in confusion because each of them heard the people in the original crowd speaking in his own language. Now this crowd then came over to see what was happening, and at least some of whom had tongues of flame resting on the group in front of them. So you could see this spectacle going on and hear this commotion. And it is from this crowd that many were cut to the heart, as it says in verse 37, and who accepted Peter's message. Verse 41 tells us that of that crowd, an unknowable number, maybe tens of thousands, that came over to see what was going on, 3,000 were baptized that day. And the 3,000 was the delightful point made yesterday by Dr. Hazelton. Now, this would have been all very visible to the public who had come to the temple on Pentecost as their custom was, and would have certainly been noticed by the religious leaders. Far more than 3,000 people witnessed the fire and the commotion. So why is this of interest to us today? The first reason is that only by obeying God and obeying the now, shall I say, tongue-in-cheek, the now obsolete holy days of Pentecost, where people present at the one and only place where this blessing was to be given. Had anyone stayed home to just watch Pentecost services on their big screen TV, they would have missed the blessing of a lifetime receiving the Holy Spirit. They would have been able to watch others receive the Holy Spirit. But that's not how it worked, of course. More broadly, Orthodox Christianity is hostile to any suggestion that God's holy day have meaning for Christians. On the holy days, Pentecost presents the special challenge to this hostility. By the way they handle the details, the Orthodox Christianity has created a diversion away from the importance of the holy days as one component of the complete system of holy days, as well as merely the day of the church was founded. You know, that's what they say, and when they say it, it's not untrue exactly, but the emphasis and the intent is to deflect from the holy days. Of the several meanings of oikos, the expert translators have universally chosen the one that leads away from God's plan of salvation, as pictured by the holy days. It is subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And this is a lesson about how obeying God brings priceless blessings to be able to understand God's truth and to immunize yourself against these diversions and errors. Instead of taking place in private in a small upper room that may have been far removed from the temple, alone out of the reach of the public, when God signaled that the Holy Spirit was available to humanity, that was an earth-shaking event. It was truly earth-shaking because it was a total change in God's relationship with humanity. For thousands of pilgrims of Jerusalem to personally witness this, it marked a change in how humanity can come to a far closer relationship with God and to be assured of being in His family forever. Today, we observe the Feast of Pentecost, and that fits with God's perfect and complete plan of salvation for every human who ever has lived and whoever will live.